So today, Parker and Andrew are going to do a two-part presentation. Andrew's going to start off by looking at data on the performance of our students with disabilities, and then Parker is going to follow up with a look or a deeper dive in for those students who are migrant students. So one thing I want to note is that we are recording this presentation to post. Is that correct? And so if we could, at least for the presentation portion, keep questions somewhat to a minimum, maybe just clarification, clarifying questions. And then we'll have an opportunity to do a more robust discussion at the end. So Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Good morning and thank you all. I'm pleased to present to you today on students with disabilities in our endeavor to look at performance gaps. So at the end of this presentation, I want you to walk away with a clearer picture of basically three overarching ideas here. One of them is that achievement gaps are complex. Facing high-stakes decision on achievement gaps can be risky business. And three, when we're making high-stakes decisions based on achievement gaps or performance gaps, they need to be right and defensible 100% of the time. So as we're going through this, I want you to be thinking, are we really doing this the very best we can? So the memo in your board packet begins on page 39 and addresses some of these key questions. Most of the data in the board packet represents national data. The things you're going to be seeing here is pretty much Washington data, brand new stuff. So I will make several references to the board packet, but I'll tell you when that happens and what pages you can find that information on. This presentation just sort of scratches the surface of this topic, and we expect to talk more about this at the July board retreat. One final reminder before we get started. There is no action item related to this, so this is really for information only, information about performance gaps. So we in education, we make a lot of high-stakes decisions based on performance of various student groups, like the students with disabilities. Just for the record, we're referencing students that have an IEP in schools. You're going to hear me reference students with disabilities. You'll hear other people reference them as students in special education, and you will even hear me reference them as SWD, because that's the subgroup that ESEA recognizes. These are all interchangeable groups. So let's take a look at one sort of high-stakes decision that we're faced with. So here's two schools, and I've tried to create them in a manner that makes them look pretty much the same. They have similar sorts of student populations, similar sort of educator workforce, and you can see their proficiency rates in reading and math and combined. We look at this combined reading and math proficiency rate to make a high-stakes decision about this student group. This is what the process we use in identifying focus schools. Look at the reading and math proficiency rates for the various subgroups, and the lowest performing group is labeled as a focus school. So I posed a question for you there in red, and you don't need to answer it, you can just have an internal answer. So would you agree that school B is lower performing and should be targeted for extra supports? And with a basic understanding of how focus schools are identified, you should be answering yes. School B is lower performing. They've got that lower proficiency rate, 13.8% versus 13.9. We're going to come back to this in a minute. So just be thinking about, it seems like a pretty simple process. So there's about 140,000 students with a disability in Washington. This is about 6% larger than 4 years ago. In total, students with disabilities comprise about 13% of the state public school population. I've got 3 different images from various things. OSPI staffs, the Special Ed Advisory Council, they meet 4 times per year and advises on education-related issues for special ed students. Several months back, the governor, or the Office of the Ombuds to the governor released a report regarding special education and some recommendations for the governor. And of course, OSPI press release talking about the identification of focus schools and the support for that. So I'm going to show you some of a few things about the population of the distribution of students with disabilities across Washington, and then we're going to talk about their education performance for just a moment. So anything highlighted in blue represents the top quartile of schools, and this is the percentage of students in a district who are SWD, or students with disability, who actually tested in 2014. So anything highlighted in blue is the top quartile, and those districts highlighted in dark blue, they tested more than 20% of their students were students with disabilities. And anything in blue is more than 16%. And this is above the state average of about 13%. And the point of this is that there's not really any real pattern here. It's pretty wide distribution across the state. So I've highlighted here, these are the 5 schools in the state that have the highest percentage of students with disabilities who tested. So you can see at these schools, more than 1/3 of the students were students with disabilities. And you can see that their school level proficiency rates are, respectively high, and that their growth rates for some of the groups are fairly high also. So I just want you to read this, take a moment to read that for yourself. Just a second. So we do believe that all students can learn and reach grade level expectations. And when they do not, we look at that 3rd bullet. Have the appropriate services and supports been provided? In a discussion with OSPI folks just yesterday, I was told in no uncertain terms that it may not be totally appropriate to expect all students with a disability to meet grade level expectations. I'm told that not every student has the capacity to do that. And there's not any one category that these students occur in. They can occur in any one of the different categories that the state recognizes. So even though we don't, it's probably inappropriate to expect 100% proficiency from this group if you follow the logic of OSPI. But for purposes here, I think we do want to say that just because a student is in special education does not mean they can't meet grade level expectations. And we should expect students to meet those expectations, but we know that not every student will. So let's take a look at some Washington data. So this is data from the Achievement Index. This is 3-year averaging of reading and math proficiency. These are district level averages. And highlights in orange are lower performing schools. These are schools where the combined reading and math proficiency rate are less than 18%. And in the dark blue highlights, these are these are district averages where the students with disabilities average over 40% proficient in reading and math. So I want to point out this big swath in the middle of low performing schools. You're going to see this pattern repeated on a couple of more slides. Let's look a little bit more closely at some of the schools. So these are the highest performing schools based on students with disabilities, combined reading and math proficiency rates. And all I want to point out here is two things, well, probably three things. First of all, even with these high-performing students, there's still a substantial gap between the students with disabilities and the school averages. And secondly, the concentration of these schools in the Puget Sound area. Excuse me. And thirdly, for those of you that recognize some of these schools, you'll recognize that these are pretty low poverty schools. And this is not a surprise to us because we know that proficiency rates are correlated with poverty rates. When we look at the highest performing schools based on growth, you see that the high performing growth schools are expanded throughout the Puget Sound area. But the difference here is that you'll notice that the FRL percentages are much higher. These are some pretty high poverty schools, and you see that high growth can occur in high poverty schools pretty regularly. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the low performing schools. Our focus school identification process is high stakes decisions, high stakes accountability. And all I want you to see here is that most of the schools identified as focus schools were done so because of low students with disability performance. And secondly, there's a handful of districts that have quite a high number of focus schools identified on account of students with disabilities. I know you're thinking, why would these districts have such a high number of schools? And this is something I'm going to be looking into and discuss it at the board retreat in July. Because the truth is, I've looked at web pages from each of these schools, and it's difficult to see anything that jumps out at you as to why they would be identified. This map shows the location of the focus schools, and you can see the districts highlighted in red and pink and orange. Those have more than one or two or three focus schools identified on account of low-performing students with disabilities. And you can see that there's a broad swath in the middle of the state that corresponded with the graph or the chart we saw earlier. These are the districts where the lowest performing students with disabilities are found. And again, you see districts in the central part of the state, but now we see a few more in the Puget Sound area and a few more east of I-5, or west of I-5. These are the lowest growth, these are schools with the lowest growth across the state. You'll see some of these are very high poverty schools, but these are also very low performing schools as a group. Let's take a quick look at graduation rates. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, this is a clarification question, just really quick. So are we looking at growth or proficiency? Because if we're looking at growth, they could be low growth because they're high proficiency.
Okay, this chart is high growth, or this shows low growth, yes, but the growth model, the SGP data, is irrespective of proficiency rates. It's not correlated. So high growth state, schools that are high growth aren't necessarily high or low performing with respect to proficiency rates.
Typically though, a school with a high proficiency rate is quite a bit more likely to have a low growth rate. There's less growth to be had. If you're performing at 98% proficiency, there's not a lot of room to grow, so you show a low SGP.
I will be happy to talk with you offline about this, but I do want to, for the record, a school with 98% proficiency rate can either be high growth or low growth, and there's a very low correlation between proficiency and school level median SGP. And I can talk to you about that later. So this chart shows the highest and lowest graduation rates. This is the 5-year adjusted cohort rate, and this is 3-year averaging. And districts in blue represent these handful of schools here, and you can see that the graduation rate for the students with disabilities are very high. In orange are the lower graduation rates, and you can see that these are very low. So quite a gap in many respects. So for those of you that are reading about these expectations, the aggregation of students into this group, this is exactly what we do. We take a handful of students, we throw them into a group, and we basically dilute what we know about their performance. So the Individuals with Disability Act that was reauthorized in 2004 recognizes 14 different disability groups. We aggregate all these into a single group, and then we make a collective decision about this group of students without really knowing too much about them. So let's take a closer look at this group. So this chart simply shows the relative numbers of the 14 disability groups in Washington as compared to the US. And I've noted a couple of exceptions here. In Washington, we have a few higher students with health impairments, a few more students identified here, and a few more students identified with developmental delays. And we have a little bit lesser number of students for communication disorders. But the point here is the trend in Washington is very similar to the US trend. This chart shows the absolute number of students with disabilities in the various groups. So I want to point out a couple of things. First, these first 7 categories here, these represent 96% of the student population. So